I'm Richard Jones. I work for the Centre for English Local History at the University of Leicester, and I'm a lecturer in landscape history. For the last 4 years I've been working in the Centre for English Local History, and I've realised that I have never really thought through that little label local. And when I started to investigate the idea, I suddenly realised that it was incredibly complicated. Some people's local is very closely defined, and some people's local encompasses a much larger area. So what I wanted to do was to conceive a practical project that we could explore this idea. And so for the month of September, we are eating only produce sourced within a 2-mile radius of the house. The aim is to really explore that word local, whether it can be defined as a space or whether it can be defined as something else. And what seems to be emerging from this research is that it isn't a defined area that really matters. It is the personal connections that you make with other people. In other words, it's about community. And I think that is an interesting and a useful insight, because when we start to explore local history as academics, perhaps we often define our study area in terms of space, but in fact perhaps we should be defining it in terms of people. I think it is interesting to reflect on how the notion of local may have changed over time. We're certainly very clear that we're unable in this project to reproduce the local experience or how it may have been experienced in the past, but we can start to get some insights about what matters, potentially mattered to people in the past, about how time-consuming sourcing and processing food was, how it becomes an obsession, a daily obsession, something that has to be prioritised over everything else. Food is a really useful medium through which to explore these ideas, because we all actively use food to say something about ourselves. What we eat, how we present that food, who we share that food with, all says something about ourselves, and that has been a human constant. So in the past, food was also saying things about particular people. So it gives us that way into people's lives in the past, the way they thought, the way they tried to present themselves, and how their relationships that they struck up between their animals, their crops, their soils and so on. Two things have been particularly challenging during this project. The first is finding sufficient time to prepare food. Much of our day, of course, is spent at university doing what we are employed to do. And one realises how time-consuming sourcing and preparing food can become. It's almost a full-time job, and I suspect in the past that it was for those who kept rural households. The other challenge has been the monotony or the blandness of the food that we are consuming. We have only a small range of foods that we can eat, and despite adding what limited spices and herbs that we can garner from the garden, the food is beginning to taste the same. And that again, I think, helps us to think about rural diets in the past, which would themselves have been blander and more monotonous than those that we are now accustomed to. If we were to do this project again, I think we would do certain things differently. This time we really didn't prepare ourselves. We are less self-sufficient than we could have been, but that was a purposeful decision, because we wanted to throw ourselves at the mercy, if you like, of the wider community. But if we had a year to plan, then I think we would have carefully thought about what we might grow, how we might be able to preserve that in order to improve the range of foods that then could be consumed during any later project. Emerging from this project are some really interesting ideas that I think I can take on and apply in my research. One of the ideas that I'm thinking about at the moment is this notion of terroir, used in France, of course, to define local foods, But I think that it is a useful concept to potentially think about rural societies more generally. Terroir is all about the landscape, microclimates, soils, which give particular flavours to food, of course, but it's also about how agriculturalists practice, about heritage, and all those ideas I think you can see, if you look closely enough, at play in medieval rural communities in England.